But if we're not solving interesting problems that don't have like I can ask Siri answers, then we're going to lose kind of the interest in many ways, like the magic and the beauty of learning mathematics, which is less about like sometimes it's about tactical, practical application, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's about the joy and the wonder and the curiosity and the beauty and seeing a way that math describes the world around us. I would hate to lose all that to like, but is it practical? I actually started with the stories that I loved the most from my time in the classroom. And they each hold such power and can go in so many different directions, but they also were stories I thought were powerful to share. So I started with that. And I just, on my little note cards, I was like, I remember these students and these interactions that were so poignant. And there's a reason why they were so poignant. So I started with like, that's the story. And if I can tell that story, then what would I say was that learning moment for me, that aha for me, where that was like the backdrop of a shift in my teaching practice.
Welcome, everybody. This podcast is all about you. Why knowledge matters. Welcome. I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Jennifer Lenhardt, to discuss her book Common Denominator, published by Solution Tree. Welcome, Jennifer Lenhardt, to the podcast. It's such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Who is Jennifer Lenhardt in simply one sentence?
The one sentence challenge. Jennifer Lenhardt is she's an inquisitive, pattern-seeking, creative builder.
Now, before we really dive into the book, so can you tell us a specific moment or event that you really defined your path of one day writing a book specifically about math?
Yes. I think when I was teaching in the classroom, I started to realize that the training I'd received in school to learn to be a teacher really taught me how to be curious about what it is that's going on for students. And it's like the moment where all of that learning before becoming a teacher intersects with the actual work of being a teacher. And I realized there were a lot of lessons learned and ways of viewing student and teacher interactions um, that I hadn't read about in any other publication in terms of the way that I interpret what is going on and then work to figure out how to meet student needs and then how to disrupt these patterns of things that aren't working when it comes to teaching and learning math. And I just felt like there were a lot of stories to tell and a lot of dots to connect. And that if I could do that in this book, it would be a value to others in the field as they're trying to also sort of map their course and connect the dots between what's going on and how to figure out strategies that meet needs without being exhausted and working a million hours and scrambling just to address each individual thing.
You talk a lot, and really, this is basically your thesis about belonging, how important it is. Let's start and really frame the discussion around belonging and why you think that belonging is so important, specifically when it comes to math.
Yep. Yep. So if you think about spaces, if you can like think about a space where you feel like you belong, and what it feels like to be in that space. And when you feel like you feel like you can be yourself. It's safe, like capital S safe to be you in spaces where you belong. And what we know is foundational to learning anything cognitively is this baseline of safety. We have to know it's okay to be ourselves, to wonder our wonderings, to learn in our ways, to bring our full and multiple identities into that space. So, belonging, when we create spaces of belonging in school, we are really creating those necessary spaces for students to show up and be themselves. And if they can't show up and be themselves, they're not going to learn much, right? So we often hear in the narrative about math education about low achievement levels, but we're not talking necessarily about exclusive spaces driving low achievement levels. So we think about interventions for students who are not yet thriving in mathematics, but those interventions don't often address this sort of sense of belonging. And the wondering I have is, to what extent are we over exercising the cognitive muscle for learning mathematics and under exercising the heart muscle about spaces where we belong in school? And to what extent is addressing both required in order to like see the gains we're looking for, but really help students kind of break out of these cycles of feeling like they're just like, I'm not a math person, or this doesn't make sense to me. I'm only in this class because it's a requirement. Those types of attitudes around mathematics, I just don't see them surfacing in spaces where students really feel like they belong, and where teachers and whole buildings and districts have created, intentionally created spaces of belonging.
Tell us a little bit, because the book already, the title is really, really profound, and obviously you use a math analogy, right? But tell us a little bit why the denominator you think is really something that we should consider, as a human being in a holistic manner and matter.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. Um, I think of the denominator kind of literally and metaphorically in the way that, and I write about this in the introduction. There's this element of fractions, sort of a traditionally stacked fraction with a fraction bar, and the denominator is like what's beneath the surface, right? So there's sort of this parallel imagery around like if the numerator is what we see above the surface, that's the stuff students say to us, the things we say to each other. Um, that's this like what's on the outside, if you will. And the denominator is what's beneath the surface. And understanding the denominator is how we sort of work with and operate with fractions and can do things with those numbers. Often involves working with understanding the denominator. So if you're working with 2/3 and 1/4, you can work with those fractions as they are, but also once you find a common denominator, you can understand a little bit differently and operate or more efficiently, maybe, with those fractions. So the framing of this for the book is really to say, like, what's above the surface? That's what we lead. That's what I lead with in every chapter. When am I ever going to use this? I don't have a pencil. Or things students or teachers say to themselves, or even in the profession, like, I have 250 students. I couldn't possibly, right? That's the numerator. And when you dig in a little and say, like, okay, what's under the surface of that? You will most often see, my experience is you will most often see some factors of engagement and some factors of belonging. And it's nearly impossible in many instances to separate those two things, to isolate them. They often just run together.
And so now the question is really, how can an educator actually apply this, and you really give very tangible tools and strategy to do so? Talk a little bit more about the how to really foster this belonging in the classroom in order to elevate really the students' feeling of belonging.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the how is twofold. There's always a little bit of like, let's get really curious about what's going on underneath the surface and start asking more questions about what's going on. So before we jump to doing, let's think a little bit about, and that can include getting the perspectives and input of other folks, right? Who else sees this situation differently? Who's on your team where you can run this by them and say, like, hey, is this how these students are all operating across the school or just in math class? Um, so get collaborative get curious about what's really going on, and then think about meeting the needs, sort of these root needs, as opposed to addressing the surface question. And I write about this in the book. Like students, the classics are like, when does this class get out? Is parallel with like, when am I ever going to use this? Or I don't have a pencil. These things come up, but and we can answer the question directly. You can post the schedule on the board. You can say, class gets out in 15 minutes. But when the question keeps coming up, you got to ask, what is this kiddo really asking that they're not finding the words for? And sometimes the tools I offer in the book, how you do that, you might talk with students directly after class. You might say, like, I hear you ask this every day, and I'm wondering what you need. Um, those types of things where you just get really direct and say, like, hey, let's craft the language in our class, in our space together, where you can use the words to ask for what you need. I need a break, right? When does this class get out? Is maybe the same as, could be the same as, I need a break. I need a thinking break. I need a moving break. Anyhow, so once you have more clarity around the need, then the tools that you apply come from a lot of different fields, not just mathematics. Sometimes we lean into these math resources to write a differentiated lesson or provide more scaffolding for the learning. Sometimes we reach back to these elementary school lessons around practicing our words and using the words to describe what we need. We lean into what we know about physical movement and the need for brain breaks and sort of the lift. I think, especially if these double blocked classes that are almost 120 minutes or longer, where are we giving our students the room, the physical room to get up and move around? How do we build that into the lesson? How do you use seating charts in a way to gather formative assessment data efficiently so you're not taking home and grading stacks and stacks of paper? The book offers strategies for meaningful feedback that actually moves learning forward rather than simply touching and grading every paper. There's a difference between like correcting work versus like grading work. I think that's important to think about, and providing students with feedback and creating structures where they provide feedback to each other, right? So the book has all of the tools that I found incredibly useful, and to really have a sustainable approach to creating belonging in the classroom. It has recommendations for how to get to know your students in initially at the beginning of the year or as the year continues. It has recommendations for um, what to do when the classroom culture is starting to break down and maybe something needs to be restored. I just think of it as like accidents are going to happen. Things happen in a classroom learning culture that corrode that sense of belonging, but it can be restored. So I offer ideas around bringing that back and creating spaces sometimes of healing for teachers and students to reset and continue to cultivate that space of belonging.
It's also interesting. You also talk about sometimes it's not just the academic support that students need, but we also should actually factor into all this the emotional support and need that the student has in really to accelerate his learning in math. Now, some might say, well, yeah, I simply do not have time for this. That's not my role as a teacher. And I think especially today
Yes.
there's so much on our plates as teachers, right? But you actually offer a very good response to these tricky challenges. So what is your response if someone says, look, I simply do not have time for any emotional support. I can simply teach, and that's what I'm paid for, math, and that's it.
And I think that's another example of when a person says that, it's likely that there's something else going on underneath. So maybe a sense of overwhelm, maybe a sense of being overworked or underappreciated, maybe feeling unqualified to provide that emotional guidance. I think knowing more about what drives that statement would change my answer about what you would do next. I do think that the emotions are coming into the class whether or not you want to address them. They're coming in with there's no way a student's brain can be like separated from their body, cannot be connected to their emotions. So they are coming together. They're going to get a seat at the table. Um, I do think though, really want to honor and respect the boundary around the profession from the perspective of like, I'm not a mental health provider. I'm not certified for that. I didn't go to school for that. And it's really important to know how to recognize when what you're observing just sort of needs some guidance and a little bit of teaching versus the support of a counselor, a school psychologist, something else. There are complex things going on for our students. And as teachers, one of our roles is to really notice when student needs an advocate for additional support from the system that isn't going to happen in the classroom, right? So I think teachers can start to get a sense of that and have really direct conversations at their schools with your team, with your school counselor, with your staff. What is my role? Ask the question. What is my role in supporting students' emotional growth and connectedness? What's the counselor's role? What's the principal's role? What's the school psychologist's role? How do we work together as a team, but really stay in the lane we feel equipped for? Um, and then if there's an opportunity to learn new skills, what are they? And how would you go about learning them? I think discomfort with emotions is different than being unequipped. And sometimes there's some work for us to do ourselves to practice finding those emotional skills to continue to integrate the work. I just can't imagine a space where neglecting the emotional front or the sense of belonging will deliver on the math teaching you're hoping it will. I can't envision the space where saying I'm just going to teach math is actually working out. I'm not sure that's actually working out for anyone. So I think we need to try something different.
Yeah, it's so true. It's really hard to actually think about this in somehow, a separate way, right? Everything is really interrelated, and I think that what makes teaching and learning so interesting and so holistic and complex, right? Because it's really about life and all what's really around it. So everything reinforces somehow one another. So it's a really really tough. Tough environment, but also a beautiful environment. So it really demands so much of the students, but also of the teacher. And I think to reconcile the two is always kind of a thin line that we walk on, but I think ultimately it's all worth it, right? And what I also appreciate, you really mentioned that we should really focus on the opportunity gap and not so much on the achievement gap. So usually we always talk about achievement, but we don't really focus on the opportunity. Please elaborate on this.
Yeah, thank you. So when we hear narrative around the achievement gap, what we're talking about is the outcome, the end result. And there are a lot of ways that we can trouble the narrative around the outcome because the achievement gap is like as measured by what, right? These assessments are good for whom? Who are they designed for? What are we assessing? Why would we see, you're going to keep seeing data aligned with sort of some of the inherent flaws of the metrics that are being gathered to determine that achievement gap. Um, and I say that in air quotes because in many ways it feels manufactured from in terms of the actual data we're gathering and how we're gathering information about students. I'll give a small example. In the state that I lived and taught in, the math test could be read aloud to you, but only in English. So if you struggle to understand the premise of the question, am I assessing your math skills or your English comprehension skills? I don't, right? So it's sort of like, what are we really seeing here? But aside from that, the opportunity gap is a way to frame it from the cause, right? If achievement is the outcome, opportunity is the cause. So when we think about what are the learning opportunity gaps we are seeing between maybe from one teacher to the next, from one school to the next, what are the actual learning opportunities afforded to students? And where are the gaps in those learning opportunities? We think about skilled teachers who are highly qualified and able to meet the needs of all their learners, and then teachers who are still developing that skill set. right? That's an opportunity gap. What are we doing to shore that up? How are we addressing the learning opportunities students have? Because while a teacher may have the opportunity to refine their practice over years, that student has sixth grade this year, and that's kind of it. And then they're moving to seventh grade with or without the learning opportunities that they needed, right? So when we think through it that lens, this is more about getting to the root cause of the learning structures and opportunities and ensuring students have equitable learning access, and are able to engage in equitable learning opportunities, and then seeing what are the things that happen next for this group of students or any group of students that actually has been afforded the learning opportunities that they needed. When I think about students not achieving at a rate or a standard that we might be expecting, the first question I ask is, what are the structures in which they're learning, right? And I describe it as like many times there's a mismatch between what it is a student needs to learn this content and what it is that it's how it is that it's being taught currently. So for some, we're going to meet the needs of some students with some practices, and you have to figure out how to meet the needs of all students with other practices.
Now, and you also talk about this really in the book, right? How do you make math relatable to the student, right? And that's what you really, to some extent, I think, mean by structure. Uh, Tell us a little bit more about this specifically, how we make it relatable to every student, basically.
Right, right. This is an interesting thought because I've just had a lot of instances where folks say, well, to make math relevant, this is a really baseline example, we'll change the context of the word problem to be something students are familiar with. So if they're in a rural community, maybe we'll make this about farming, if it's a problem about area or something, right? So the presumption is often that if the context is familiar, the math is accessible. I think often relevance and accessibility go hand in hand. So, what we're often doing is trying to put math in a context that's familiar, which doesn't move the needle entirely on accessibility, the way that manipulatives, multiple representations, opportunities to build conceptual understanding. When the tasks are more accessible, math becomes less about, will I use this in my actual life, right? And think about this advent of AI and the ongoing integration of technology. Our students have tremendous access to like technical problem solving skills. They could practically just ask Chat GPT what the area of that is. Why do they need to figure it out? So, thinking through what it is that students really are developing, which is this skill set they'll need no matter where they are, like isolating a variable and analyzing the context and understanding how these things are playing together, and problem solving skills in general, perseverance when it doesn't make sense right away, um, interacting and collaborating and co-problem solving with peers, conveying your ideas and communicating what you need in a way that another person could understand, very much in the lane of math, the math practices. Those are the types of relevant. So it's like I'm convinced it maybe is less about the context of the word problem, if you will, and more about if the students feel like they have the tools to get into the work and believe that once they're in it, they could figure it out or find the ways through it if it gets confusing and hard. And when they feel like their struggle's worth it and they feel proud of the outcome of working hard to figure something out, I think my experience was I heard less and less, I'm never going to paint a wall. It doesn't matter how much paint I use. Right. And that's sort of like, you're not going to be able to find a math context that is relevant, air quote, relevant for every student every day. But if we're not solving interesting problems that don't have like, I can ask Siri answers, then we're going to lose kind of the interest in many ways, like the magic and the beauty of learning mathematics, which is less about tactic. Like sometimes it's about tactical, practical application, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's about the joy and the wonder and the curiosity and the beauty and seeing a way that math describes the world around us. I would hate to lose all that to like, but is it practical?
How did you find the joy in math?
I think that's really, really similar to what I was describing around like it's persevering, it's setting out on a problem where you're like, I think I could figure this out. I wonder, and the wonder, I wonder what happens if I try this first. What would I try next? How can I untangle pieces of information that seem convoluted or tied together? There's a lot of logic and curiosity, um, and I do remember, I'll just be nerdy for a second. I do remember having these long, complex algebraic equations, and the goal was to like simplify essentially or like solve the equation. And that inverted triangle of like this long, complex situation, and then step by step by step by step, and like there's your answer. Maybe I'm a little bit of a geek, but that is incredibly satisfying. But I think this is real life as well. There's this long, complicated problem you have to figure out in actual life, whether it's a personal or a work or anything related. And step by step, you break that down into pieces, and there's a way to get through it and figure out the answer you're looking for. I think that applies over and over again. And when you can trust that that happens and you've had enough experiences where your thinking and your perseverance have paid off, you start to believe you are a figure outer. And if we can have students enter into adult life believing they can figure out this complex world, that's a good thing. Instead of feeling like this complex world is just gobbling them up, which I think it can feel like in a math class. It can feel like this content or this class is just consuming me and I'm getting swallowed inside it instead of like I'm actively navigating through these complexities.
How did you go about the book while writing it? Did you also approach it to some extent, like little by little? It's like solving a math problem?
Yeah, it was little by little. I actually started with the stories that I loved the most from my time in the classroom. And they each hold such power and can go in so many different directions, but they also were stories I thought were powerful to share. So I started with that. And I just, on my little note cards, I was like, I remember these students and these interactions that were so poignant. And there's a reason why they were so poignant. So I started with like, that's the story. And if I can tell that story, then what would I say was that learning moment for me, that aha for me, where that was like the backdrop of a shift in my teaching practice or something new, like those moments like, aha, there is something here that I'm going to explore in more depth. So when I wrote the book, I started with the stories, and then I think, pieces move a lot, like what goes in a chapter, how you arrange it, which chapter goes first and then second. Those are sort of moving puzzle pieces, but I felt confident that they were the right puzzle pieces to start with. And then it was just a matter of figuring out, with the help of amazing editors, a solution tree to sort of pull together a coherent journey so that readers could follow that as well.
You know, I want to dive into actually one of these stories, and you tell a story of basically cleaning up the dust when a student basically doesn't really do what he's supposed to do, but you really talk basically through this problem, what actually a teacher ought to do. And I find it really, really compelling to give this sense of really belonging that really breeds that classroom that everyone feels he belongs or she belongs, and then somehow something really can emerge out of this. So please tell us again a little bit this story, how this all unfolded, and what you mean by cleaning up the dust.
Hmm. I think about, was this the kiddo who was angry? Are you talking about the story where the kiddo wrote on their pre-assessment some big cuss
Exactly.
words to me? Is that the one you're referencing?
Exactly.
Yeah. Um, well, I think that secondary students often have big words and big adult vocabulary that they are using in contexts that they're not prepared for the consequences of. So in this story, the student writes an F word or several on a paper to me as a pretest and sort of slammed it on my desk. And I thought to myself, it was this split second decision. Do we Is the student going to receive the consequences that this, according to the school handbook, the policy on swearing at teachers, probably all the things, or will I take that as this kid's best effort to communicate a need to me? And my job in that moment is to honor that there is an unmet need here that won't be met with a consequence. That need will not be met with a referral or in school suspension or any of the things. So in this moment, there's this like, you have to be the grown up, you have to be the adult when kiddos are disintegrating. And often they need, think about this imagery of like they need to be held more than they need to be sent out, right? Like that's hurt, that anger. And there was so much to learn about what this, and I don't mean actually held, obviously, but I'm sort of metaphorically in a space that's safe for them to be just as big and angry as they need to be. In this context, the whole class was still safe. I'm not talking about students who are creating unsafe conditions physically by like blowing out. I That has happened too. There's a different strategy for that. But in this instance, I sort of took this as a student's um maybe an effort to see how sturdy I would be with the full force of their frustration and the full force of their, like, fatigue, not really feeling like they belong in math. And with kind of that steady assurance that I was unbothered by the cussing and unbothered that, like, we're gonna figure this out together, there's this opportunity to say, like, I'm right here with you. Not that something you've done will create disconnection from this class, but even when that happens, you still are connected and belong. And I think that students maybe don't have enough of those experiences in secondary school, where, like in middle and high school, where they really can make a mistake with their words, can make a mistake with their maybe the volume of their emotions, and be met with connection rather than be met with disconnection. Um, so that's sort of where that story is. And then like it's okay that we will help clean up the things that happen here in this space. Just like if a young child spilled juice, they're not left to clean it all on their own, they get help. This student is saying, like, they have some things going on, they could use some help, whether it's from me, later from a school psychologist, from another sort of mentor teacher that they really liked and trusted. Again, it's just sort of looking holistically, what's going on here? And might that be met with compassion rather than consequence?
Do you think today's students really have a harder time than, let's say, we have it, let's say 20, 25, 30 years ago?
Yeah, I go. I think I think that there are so many factors students today have experienced. If you think about the context in which they were born and the world in which they have lived for their entirety of their lives, whether you think about a global pandemic, economic downturn, um, if you think about that, like ever increasing amounts of student violence in school violence, like you ask the question, like, where are we really safe? And I think that young kids absorb that intensity without necessarily having the cognitive development to metabolize it or process it. So as an adult living through a global pandemic, there are effects, but I have a fully developed cognitive capacity to metabolize those experiences, and our young people do not. They're like developmentally, their brains can only do so much. And with the presence of sort of devices always and the interconnectedness, while there's sort of a really wide lens on trauma and suffering and hardship across the world. So you think about the input where students have an awareness of global conditions in a way that I think you and I probably didn't know a lot because we just didn't have the same information as a fire hose all the time. And conditions, digital conditions that our students are living through while the adults are trying to figure out how to keep them safe. But like in the meantime, they're in it right now, right? So you think about schools like, what will our device policy be this year? And it just feels like how adults are playing catch up structurally to what students have been experiencing for years and years and years in their lives. And those do create different learning conditions, full stop.
Yeah, it's really crazy. It's almost like flying the plane while building it, and that's what we are constantly doing, basically catching somehow up, right? At least now there's more and more consensus, really, about how we should, handle cell phones in schools and so on. So more and more, really, even countries start actually banning cell phones for students, in schools, which I really find is so important. I think there's no way around that because, as you said, you can only absorb so much. And I think what was very comforting in our day and age is that ignorance can be very comforting, right? So sometimes it's much easier if you don't know than you actually know, right? And just this complexity which becomes so, and it's just accelerating, in a just in a rate that no one really can understand and really handle as people. So what do you do in order to keep your sanity in terms of all the noise that's going on? For example, do you use social media or not? And tell us a little bit why you use it or not.
Yeah. I use two social media outlets. I use X from time to time and LinkedIn. I've never been on Facebook, very much on purpose. I was on Instagram for a while and then paused because, and here's something that's interesting actually, and maybe this is a lesson for how we engage students with this as well. It is less about controlling social media use because of some external requirement about what is good or not good for you. However, if you can be a noticer of what helps you and what harms you, you can make informed decisions about where you want to engage in the world and how on your own terms. I'm not saying Instagram's bad for everyone. I'm saying it wasn't good for me. I'm not saying Facebook is bad for everyone. I'm saying it wasn't like not a decision. I knew I should never go there. Um, so you have to know sort of yourself in order to understand. And in many ways, I think we can teach our students the same. Notice when you're reading this book. If you get to, I talked to my young kids about this. If that starts to feel scary, you can stop reading. Did you know that? You can notice, right? We teach this with digital literacy. You stumble upon a website and you have a gut feeling, listen to it, shut it down. It doesn't matter. Like we can teach ourselves to be responsive to the spaces where we're growing and thriving and to back away from spaces that we instinctively sort of have a gut reaction to, like, this isn't good for me. Um, so my interaction with social media is based on that. If it starts to feel like this isn't good for me, I am not having more authentic Gen thoughts and having more authentically Gen creative inspirations. And if it's not leaning in that direction, it's okay to just not engage, right? Um and it can be difficult. I think as an adult, you can certainly get sucked into the scrolling and the noticing and just wanting to stay informed. But to notice, like you said, like, how do you stay sane? And it's never through my device, actually. Actually, that's not true. It's never through social media. Sometimes through my device, whether I'm connecting with family or friends or having a real authentic conversation. But I find that like grounded centeredness doesn't come from technology for me. It comes from maybe gardening, hiking, kind of the coast, being near big bodies of water. These are the things that I've learned over time help me feel more like me, and less like I'm being flooded by that fire hose of information. As an adult, I'm as susceptible to that quantity of input as a younger person might be. So regulating that and recognizing like where do I have choice? Where can I exercise my agency and say, "Oh, I actually feel really great when I spend time on a Saturday working on a puzzle with my kids. So, I should make sure I do more of that and maybe some less of some other things where I don't feel better after doing them. I don't feel any more connected to myself, right? And I think those are similar things that as we learn them as adults, we can sort of narrate that journey. It's less about telling kids what to do, I think, so much as narrating our journey and letting them learn from it if they choose, in some ways.
And that's also really where modeling comes in, right? And oftentimes adults are as much addicted to these media than kids are, right? And so, what would you
Yep.
say a parent who struggles with, let's say, their kids' social media use? What is the best way to really go about?
Um, I would say first, there are a lot of experts on kids and teens and social media use, and we should leverage and listen to what they're saying. It's been studied. Psychologists have recommendations, and I can share a few things that I've learned through the process, which is to engage students and young people in conversations about the need they're trying to meet by engaging with social media. What is it that you're trying to get out of your time on Instagram? What is the need that you have that it's meeting? Because I don't know that social media use sort of like agnostically is not necessarily problematic. It's this maybe we see sort of fixated behaviors or leaning towards like not able, what does it actually mean to have a habit that becomes an addiction? What does it look like to become, right? And these are learning opportunities for students to say like, oh yeah, I could see like, how does it feel if you don't have your phone during the day? And what is it that you're trying to get out of those engagements? And um, I've learned from my own kids, they'll share things like, I'm trying to connect, right? Like I'm being on my device to try to connect. And yet what's fascinating is that connection here through a screen can be at the cost of connection here in the room. Like, but who's right here in our neighborhood, in our home, in our family, like these connections with people right nearby. So there's a need to connect that's makes so much sense. And in some ways, you leave your social media time. The question is to a kiddo, do you feel more connected after the time you spent? Because you started off saying you needed connection and then you engaged in this activity and did it meet the need? Did you feel more connected after that? And letting that journey and exploration unfold so students can start to connect those dots. Again, it's like building your conceptual understanding rather than saying, here's the formula sheet. There's not like a formula of like 45 minutes of Instagram is safe and it's not a formula like that. It's more about conceptual understanding of who I am, what I'm trying to do through this interaction, noticing whether or not it's working, and then adjusting depending on what I find out.
And it's really what you talk about the book, right? It's so crucial. I mean, belongingness is really one of these fundamental human identity needs, right? And that's why we are doing it, right? That's why it's so important for a teacher to foster this belongingness for each and every child, which ultimately translates also outside of the classroom. Why do we go to social media? Usually we want to have a sense of belonging, connectedness, right? A sense of security, whatever
Yeah.
it is, recognition. And so it's really, really important, as you really mentioned, we have to really understand what is really underneath, right? What are the drivers that kids, make them do whatever they do. And so it also
That's right.
poses the question, of course, then, parents, right? It's so important to have this connection and have also this time and dedicate one's time, if possible, to one's kids, right? And on the other hand, it's also hard because parents are working, most of them. They have to in order to make a living. So it's really, really not easy. And it's a really, really tough position that I think today's youth are in, and really children. So I'm glad that I am not, I didn't grow up in this particular time because it's just overwhelming. I can't imagine how I will manage that as a young kiddo. So,
I do think adults are in a role where they can help create the structures kids need to grow up and let their brains develop a little bit while they're right. Like we think about structural safety measures. And I by that I mean when kids start to crawl, you plug the outlets and you remove things off the floor that they might put in their mouths, right? Developmentally, there are some wise moves adults can do to help kids stay safe as they explore the world around them, as they learn, grow, and explore. A kid cannot develop if when they start to crawl, they're put in a cage or they're put in a pack and play and left to be there all day. They need to move around their environment to learn and grow. As grown-ups, our responsibility is to attend to some safety measures in that environment and to be nearby for when that kiddo needs more help than we thought or is getting close to something more dangerous than we hope for them to experience. It is not that different with teens. The environment is different, right? You're not talking about plugging outlets, but when you think about and ask the question, what in this environment structurally do I actually need to keep my students or young ones a little bit away from because it's too dangerous and developmentally they might not be able to stop themselves yet. Right. So developmentally, a 2 year old's curiosity is like, probably I should stick my finger in that outlet or like put a fork in there. So we create a barrier so that that doesn't happen because the consequence of it is deadly. And so there's some risks we don't take with teens and young people because the consequences of them are so serious and permanent. And I think maybe in some ways we can analyze that. Again, it's this like collaborative discussion, like what can we learn from what's working for other parents? What can we learn from mental health providers who are willingly sharing information either online or in community forums in schools who are helping us discern and navigate and learn what we need to learn to create those environmental conditions where students can grow, be curious, explore, get in a little bit of those situations where they have to it's good. We need our kids to like navigate uncertainty a little bit and have a choice to make and keep developing. So how do we balance and create the conditions where they are learning, growing, expanding? They're not in a completely insulated environment, but they're also not having access to the things that are so deeply dangerous. And what are those things? Is there a shared understanding of what those things are? I think it's about asking a lot of those questions and as an adult doing some self-reflection on to what extent you might have an opportunity to learn more, right? So it's okay to learn a little bit as you go. You don't need to know everything about the trajectory of teen development. If you have an 11-year-old, like start there, right? If you have a 12-year-old, start there. There is really powerful resources out there to help us figure it out. And maybe that's
who
one of the benefits of like social media and the internet is there's more free access to a wide range of information for you um, in terms of getting your hands on the insight that you need without having to go too far or pay.
So true. Who was your role model, and how did you figure out that this is the person that you might want to follow?
That's a good question. I think there were different role models in different seasons, I think, of my life. When it comes to math, I had the good fortune of having the same math teacher from Algebra 1 through calculus. And she was amazing. Her name's Mrs. Allen. And what I appreciated the most about Mrs. Allen's approach to teaching was she was always unbothered by my confusion and certain she could find another way to explain it if it didn't make sense yet. So she could teach the class in the lesson. We could get going on our assignment. I would get stuck and confused. I'd say, Mrs. Allen, this doesn't make any sense. She's like, what part? But she was just so steady in her assurance that she could find a way to help this make sense, no matter how many different varieties of explanations. She never said something like, well, I already explained it, or there's an example on the board, or what, like I never felt like I was dumb for not knowing or not getting it right away. That was a big influence on my experience of feeling like curiosity in math was worth it. Like asking the question was safe and you could expect the people who knew the answer to help you find the way, right? Without just saying, here, let me do it for you, or you just need more practice or whatever. I came to learn in math that I could be curious and expect that curiosity to be met with actual teaching. Like, how else could we explore this or think about it? And that was really foundational to believing, I think, that I am a person who could figure it out if I kept asking the right kinds of questions and kept seeking the input of folks who know the way.
What's your daily routine that you do that really helps you, remain sane and really so active? You're a mother. You are also, you do so many things. You're an author. What do you do?
Yeah. Um, I don't have a everyday routine, but I do have some things that get integrated pretty regularly. I know I mentioned gardening earlier, and I do love to garden. I love to be nurturing, cultivating plants. I'm always curious, like, is this going to grow here? Maybe not. What would it need to thrive? I love it. I love it. I love being sort of out in nature. My actual job requires a lot of desk work. So when I get to be out of the office and in nature and hearing the wind in the trees and smelling the plum trees blossoming in the backyard, those are the types of things that help me stay really sane. And on the hardest, most complex seasons of my life, that outdoor time has been so literally grounding for those journeys. In terms of other things like for fun to bring joy, I do love puzzles. I do love playing with my kids. We love going on bike rides. It seems basic. Every now and then we can steal away to the coast for a vacation. We read. Um, we connect with neighbors. We goof around a lot. We have silly dance parties. We play imagination. I think all those things are really fun. Um, that sort of help me stay sane. And a really strong several cups of coffee each day. That helps me stay sane too.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, last question: what makes you feel truly alive?
Mm. I think I feel alive anytime I'm in pursuit of the truth. The simple pursuit of it. I don't know that I always find it, but the pursuit of it, the the curiosity, the wondering, the engaging with the world to get closer to the things that are true. I have sort of a that's not true radar where something comes up in life and I'm like, I just don't think that's, or at least that's not the whole truth. Something else is going on there. Engaging in that is really where I feel like the expansive, right? If you imagine like your lungs fully expanding with like a deep breath, it's in that work.
Jennifer Lenhardt, thank you so much for being on the show. And now I want to every one of you encouraged to go on solution3.com and order a copy of Common Denominator by Jennifer Lenhardt. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for being on the show. It's truly be a blessing, and I can't wait to further this conversation with you in the future.
Thank you so much for having me today. It was an honor to be here.
Jennifer Lenhardt. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.